Welcome to our panel about the patient experience and the critical role that patients, foundations, industry, and academia do together to try to accelerate gene and cell-based therapies. I'm Merit Cudkowicz, Chief of Neurology at Mass General Hospital. I'm personally an ALS physician and have worked on both gene and cell-based therapies in that disorder. Today we have an amazing panel that really represents patients, foundations, academia, and industry to discuss the critical role of patients in the experience of developing gene and cell-based therapy. They're each going to present a little bit about themselves and the foundation and the work that they do as they answer our first question. So we know that patients are involved and so important to the development of all treatments, but particularly in gene and cell-based therapy, they're very active. And we want to explore a little bit about why and what are some of these dynamics. So I might start with Dr. Beck from the Parkinson's Foundation.
Hi, I'm Jim Beck. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at the Parkinson's Foundation, which is a national grassroots organization that has a twofold mission to improve the lives of those living with Parkinson's disease today. We're also funding research for a cure for tomorrow. And when it comes to thinking about patients in these clinical trials, it's really interesting because we're talking ahead of time that we all represent different stages of patient populations. People with Parkinson's are typically diagnosed in their late 60s, and they have a different set of issues that they're dealing with compared to perhaps others. They've got several comorbidities, trying to get them to be able to manage their own disease as well as participate in trials can be difficult. But there's great potential, I think, for, as we heard yesterday from Dr. Ole Isaacson, a potential of cell therapies for helping people with Parkinson's. And I think as well as gene therapies, there's a lot of hope for those living with Parkinson's disease today.
And Annie Ganot from Solid Biosciences.
Thank you so much. Annie Ganot. I am one of the co-founders of Solid Biosciences based here in Cambridge. I also lead patient advocacy. Solid is dedicated to developing therapies for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and I have a nearly 12-year-old son with Duchenne who was the spark for our company and has really been the fabric of everything that we do, the patients and the community. And I think that as we think about cell and gene therapy and the unique nature of gene therapy, certainly for diseases like Duchenne, the patient community is critical at every single stage of the development. And I'm sure we'll get into a lot more of that and the importance of including the patient voice.
Thank you. And Dr. Staci Kallish from the National Sachs and Allied Disease Association.
Thank you. So I'm Staci Kallish. I am the president of the board of directors of National Sachs and Allied Diseases Association, or NTSAD, and I'm also a medical geneticist at the University of Pennsylvania and the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. NTSAD is one of the oldest patient advocacy groups in the country. We're commemorating our 65th anniversary this year. And we support individuals and families affected by Tay-Sachs, Canavan disease, which you just saw in the video with Rett, Sandhaft disease, and GM1 gangliosidosis. Our aims are really to advance treatments, research into treatments, to forge collaboration among patients and families, clinicians, researchers, and other stakeholders, and to support families while they're on this journey with these diseases. I, like many of our panelists, have a personal connection to NTSAD. So I'm the child of a couple who were identified to be Tay-Sachs carriers when they were planning their family. And so as my family became involved in the organization, I learned about genetics and genetic diseases and was really fascinated, which led to me to my career in medical genetics, and then led me back to the NTSAD community and the board. I think, as Annie and Jim have alluded to, that gene and cell therapy, and particularly in the diseases that we're looking at for these therapies, really makes the patient and family perspective essential. We're often talking about rare and ultra-rare diseases, and again, I know we'll talk about this more as the session goes on, but thinking about diseases where the natural history may not be well characterized, where there aren't yet clear endpoints that are established, patient and caregiver voices are really critical in developing these.
Thank you. And Dr. Rebecca Oberman, Executive Director of ML4 Foundation.
Thank you. As was just said, I'm the director of the Mucolipidosis Type 4 Foundation, and I also work with Florian Eichler, who you just saw in the video at the Center for Rare Neurologic Diseases at MGH, where I work with a few other ultra-rare disorders, bringing the patient perspectives to some developing programs for ultra-rare diseases. The ML4 Foundation is the only international foundation working to develop meaningful treatments for patients with ML4 disease. I think that there, as a number of voices have said here, a few reasons why the patient voice is so critical in the development of gene therapies. Certainly it's because in a landscape where for ultra and rare diseases there are no other available treatments, the appetite and opportunity for gene therapy in this space has been so motivating and so exciting, particularly in monogenic disorders. I think it's also important to note, as the white paper associated with this forum spelled out, that because so much of the early discovery for gene therapy has taken place in academic medical centers, patients and patient foundations have always been, and certainly in this space, highly engaged in fundraising and activity in those early discoveries. So there's kind of a natural association and energy that was developed early on in the development of those technologies. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
Thank you. And then joining us remotely is Monica Coenraads from the Rett Syndrome Research Trust. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the reason why a patient role is so important in rare diseases?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me, and I wish that I could be there in person. So I have a 25-year-old daughter with Rett syndrome. She was diagnosed at the age of 2. Rett is a childhood neurological disorder. It's typically not fatal. People with Rett can live for many decades, but with a host of very debilitating symptoms. I started the Rett Syndrome Research Trust in 2008. We're focused on genetic-based therapies and are pursuing a variety of strategy, all aimed at boosting levels of the Rett syndrome protein. I agree with everything that I've heard about why patients are so critical to advancing genetic-based therapies. I think another reason is that we're trying to really address the root cause of the disease. And there's so much excitement, so much hope, and so much expectations. And I think it's important to also manage those expectations. With great hope comes also some risk. And therefore, I think it's important for the community to be informed, transparent sharing of information, and the community plays a really critical role. Thank you.
Maybe we'll just expand on that last topic about the risk. I mean, these are such new treatments and such exciting treatments, and obviously a population that it might be vulnerable, both because of the hope, but also for some of them, the age. And I was wondering, maybe, Rebecca, if you could start and just give us your thoughts about what is that risk profile, and are people and families willing to pursue these type of treatments, and what are your concerns?
Sure. I think it is such an important question, and one that I know that we, the patient community, talk about a great deal. I do think that while safety, something that everybody here at this forum talks a great deal about, is a chief concern, I do think that in our circumstance, in a number of the ultra-rare diseases that I'm aware of and work for, the appetite and the I guess I would say appetite for risk, it is often quite high, and perhaps higher than some outside of the patient community might be aware of. And I think that goes for a couple reasons, and certainly reasons that my colleagues here on the panel could also speak to. In a situation where you have a devastating disease, a disease that often will become only more devastating over the few years, even in ML4, where you have a situation where children will live over a period of, let's say, 2 decades, but those latter, let's say, decade and a half are just terribly difficult. The opportunity to try something that could, even at the best, stop progression of disease is enormously exciting for parents and could really bring an incredible benefit to their families, something that's clinically meaningful to them. And so what is perceived as risk is something that is really exciting and something that they're willing to try precisely because there's no alternative, and the alternative that they have and that they see coming toward them is really quite tragic.
Thank you. And Jim, I didn't know if you wanted to expand on that. Obviously, you follow and help an older population of what are some of the considerations about the risks of gene and cell therapy?
Yeah, I think those are really good points that Rebecca brought up. I think the important thing to recognize from an outsider that if you live with a disease, it's always debilitating. People want a cure and are desperate for it. So there is that, as you brought up, Merit, this issue of the desperation that patients feel. But I know that you talk with patients, and this is why involving patients in the drug development process, having them early participants as companies think about this and looking for new modalities for treatment to explore them, whether they be the families or the patients themselves, especially for Parkinson's, it's really critical because they often are willing to take that risk. In Parkinson's, people already experience brain surgery for deep brain stimulation as part of as a standard of care. So the idea of brain surgery is not particularly novel. So there's a already understood risk for that. And so gene therapies have taken place, unfortunately unsuccessfully for Parkinson's, but I think the model's there and people are willing to take a chance. But again, it's really important, I think, to have that involvement of the families, of the participants at the ground level so that the development of this can be done in a thoughtful way.
And Annie, did you
I
want
just
to
want to
add
add to what Jim is saying, that I guess from an industry perspective, the most important piece and what I think people should always take away is that we can't assume we know what the risk appetite is of patients and caregivers. I think it is, as an example, our company got together with other industry and leading patient advocacy organizations like PPMD for Duchenne, Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, and really put together in a most thoughtful way, even before they were clinical trials, put together surveys and really wanted to solicit patients and caregivers to understand what the risk appetite is, what are the benefits that they're expecting. And of course, that also helped us as a company to understand how do we tackle a lot of this in our informed consent and assent documents, right? And how can we make sure that it's clearly conveyed what families are getting into, right? And we're actually, now that there are clinical studies in humans, we're now doing a new sort of installment of that survey, and we're going to be going back out to the patient communities to solicit their input. So, because patient preferences and caregiver preferences change over time, right? Like as studies progress and as data gets released and as families are, hearing more and more about what are the effects, what are the safety challenges, families can have different views than maybe they did 3 years ago, 4 years ago. So I think constantly checking in with the patient community and making sure that you are engaging and holding focus groups and working with all the patient advocacy groups is critical.
And Monica, I wanted to ask, maybe since you brought up the topic of safety, also your thoughts about the consent process and things that maybe foundations can do to explain that to patients and families or have a role in that.
Sure. Well, in terms of risk, I'll first say that no disease community is monolithic. There's going to be patients and families who are risk adverse, and those who are willing to take on significant risk. In diseases that are fatal, that choice may be more clear cut. And as I mentioned before, in Rett syndrome, the individuals can live until middle age and beyond, but with a severely impacted quality of life. My daughter's 25, she can't walk, she can't talk, she can't use her hands, she's tube fed, intractable seizures, and on and on. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't worry about what's going to happen to her when I can't care for her anymore. And I suspect that a lot of parents of adults with Rett are willing to take on a fair amount of risk. I think in terms of the informed consent, transparency is key. I think parents and patients have to absolutely know what they're getting into. We shouldn't shy away from being blunt. and explaining what the worst case scenario might be, death. But I think these are incredibly serious diseases and disorders, and there will always be people that are willing to take that risk, and in so doing will dramatically advance progress.
Thank you. Staci, in some of our prior conversations, you mentioned kind of some of the tension between maybe what families and patients want and maybe the speed that they want versus what researchers and clinicians sometimes need or often need to prove that a potential therapy is safe and effective. I wanted to know if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. So I think, to start with, I would say that I think patients and families and researchers ultimately really want the same thing, which is to have safe and effective therapies as quickly as possible. I think some of the tension that comes up between patients and families and researchers is really that for patients and families who are currently living with disease and are considering, the availability of therapies, they really are thinking, as they should, about themselves and their families. They're living with disease, and the potential of an intervention could have a significant impact on the disease course within their family. I think that for researchers, they're really thinking about the patient community as a whole, and are thinking about the risk not just to the individual patient, but the risk to the program and to the community should there be an adverse event. So should there be an adverse event in one subject who's enrolled in a study, or even should a subject be enrolled who's late in disease course, who has natural progression of disease, but that's challenging to sort out from risks of the therapy. And there's concern that this could delay or even halt a clinical program and impact the community as a whole. I think as industries start to become involved in these clinical programs, then that brings in a whole nother level of tension. And we think about our academic partners, as having professional goals, but also they get to know our families, they get to know our patients. They really develop personal stakes in their work. And in our experience, we've seen our academic partners become, very much part of our community. When industry becomes involved, there's also investors and boards to think about, and financial viability becomes another level of that tension.
I didn't know, Annie, if you wanted to expand on that in your industry role, if you see requests either from patients or from physicians for early access or compassionate use, and how you handle those kind of requests.
It's incredibly challenging, right? So it comes down to supply of drug, potential risk to the overall program. I think it's such an important point that Staci made that, from an industry perspective, you're really looking at the overall viability of that program and how can you power that for success. And families are focused on the here and now and the everyday life. And I guess perhaps as a Duchenne mom, I have a ton of empathy for every family living with this disease. I have families say to me all the time, well, I know what's going to happen to my son if we don't treat him. And it's horrific. And so constantly trying to understand the patient community, making sure that all of that feedback and that we receive from caregivers and from patients always gets fed back internally. And we have to be constantly thoughtful about how do we address these challenges? Are there additional education pieces that we can be providing to the community? Are there other outreach efforts that we can do? How can we also work hand in hand with all of our advocacy partners around the globe to make sure that we're working collectively together, and they are also, helping us as an industry to do this in the quickest and most safe way humanly possible for these patients.
Thank you. To succeed in this space, we really need that partnership with industry, and that can have challenges depending on whether maybe you're in a rare space or a less rare disease space. And I was just wondering maybe if a few people on the panel might share what issues, both positive as well as hard, you've experienced in persuading companies to prioritize your particular indication. Maybe Rebecca, you could start.
Sure. Frankly, in the ultra-rare space, even though I think we all engage in many of the same de-risking activities, whether it's natural history or developing biorepositories, or many of the same activities on the foundation level to kind of de-risk diseases, to bring in industry interest. In the ultra-rare space, where we may be talking about patient populations in the hundreds or even smaller patient populations, I think we still generally find that that's can be rate limiting for bringing in industry participation, to be perfectly honest. And that remains a great problem. It doesn't change, the number of patients that you have doesn't change either the desire or need for bringing a disease to patients, and it doesn't change the activities that you need to engage in to bring it to patients in terms of the cost or the scope of the work. So I think we still find that to a great degree there's a gap that remains in kind of making that work go the full distance to patients. We can kind of get to a certain point at academic medical centers, which is quite tremendous, really, when you think about what that work kind of gets to there. But pivoting it out fully to that first in human, I think we still haven't necessarily figured out kind of what that gap is in the absence of industry support.
Thank you. I know, Jim, if you wanted to expand on that.
I think it's really interesting. From a foundation perspective, it makes sense to us to always include the patient as part of the journey. So as an organization, we have a number of different activities, and there's a person with Parkinson's who is there beside us, whether they're on the steering committee or advisory panel, and it's just built in to the process. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things for industry to take into account. I mean, it's the new fad, but for us, it's been something we've been doing for a decade or more. But I think having that patient perspective right there at the table while decisions are being made is really important. And so, getting for us people with Parkinson's involved in the process is critical. And so I think that's one way with which we can encourage industry involvement is facilitating that process, because industry, they've got many different things they're covering potentially, and they don't know the community as well as the foundations do. So that partnership is really critical as part of it. And we have, I think, the community's best interest at heart, and so can really be a good liaison between the community and industry, just to ensure that our patient community is heard and that their needs are well represented.
And Monica, I know the Rett Syndrome Foundation, your work has been just extraordinary in getting industry interested in Rett syndrome and other related disorders. I was wondering if you might share some of your thoughts and experiences.
Sure. So industry involvement for Rett in terms of genetic-based therapies is still relatively new. 3 years ago or 4 years ago, there weren't any, and now there's 7 or 8 companies with more to come. So it has been exciting. Rett syndrome is never low-hanging fruit for companies. It's a CNS disorder. It's a diffuse brain disorder. It affects mostly girls, and girls are mosaic, meaning some cells have the right amount of the protein and the other 50% don't. We know that too much protein is detrimental. So there's a number of challenges which doesn't make Rett low-hanging fruit. So it's been really critical to identify the strategies, gene replacement, DNA editing, RNA editing, that we want to advance to recruit scientists to de-risk the programs and then figure out ways to transition that to industry, and really to incubate, get these projects started. I think the other thing we've invested in is in all the clinical research efforts that I'm sure all the foundations are moving forward, things like biorepository, patient registries, natural history studies, access to electronic medical records. And we've done that, and as those pieces are falling into place, we can see companies becoming more interested rather than when they're trying to decide what disease indication to go into. It's helpful when those kind of foundational building blocks are already in place and they don't have to build them from scratch. None of it's easy, of course, or for the faint of heart, But it's exciting to see the progress.
If I could add just one other strategy that NTSAD has been looking at to make our diseases more attractive to industry, it's really in trying to aid earlier diagnosis so that we're able to identify patients early in their disease process when they're better candidates. So this has involved working with researchers to develop newborn screening assays, to create those and to validate those, and also working with clinicians and laboratories to aid increased diagnosis among clinicians who are thinking of neurologic diseases. Work such as trying to add our diseases to genetic testing panels so that if clinicians are thinking of one group of diseases, they're making our diagnoses as well. And this, I think, can really help make your diseases more attractive to industry by giving us a better handle on the numbers of patients and being able to identify them as early as possible.
Staci, just to expand a little bit, this is a question from the audience as well, is what can foundations do to, for example, help startups or spur innovations or attract more people into that field, in addition to funding? But what are the kind of the range of things that foundations can do?
It's a great question, and I think over the years, NTSAD has taken on a number of different activities to try to fuel innovation and interest in our diseases. This has included, larger scientific symposium that we've held to bring together clinicians and researchers who are working either in our diseases or in technologies that are potentially options for our diseases. We've often held these in conjunction with our annual family conferences, which have allowed researchers to both share information with their families, but to meet our families, to learn about them, and to hopefully become motivated by hearing their stories. And our hope is that this will also entice some newer investigators or early stage career investigators into being interested in our diseases. We've taken that to the next stage with a subset of our diseases, specifically with the late onset diseases, in something that's been called a think tank that's bringing together a smaller group of researchers and clinicians working specifically in late onset diseases in a recurring manner. And the goal of this is to really fuel collaboration and innovation among this group, with the goal that they leave from each think tank with a set of concrete and actionable steps to hope to achieve working together for the next till their next think tank to advance the programs together.
Thank you. And Jim, I didn't know if you wanted to expand too, because I know your foundation's doing a lot to help spur research and build resources for the community.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Staci brings up a good point. Exposing researchers to the community is really important. We fund a number of Parkinson's researchers. We fund as many postdocs as the NIH does, focus on Parkinson science. But having them meet a person with the disease is often a game changer for them, because they can now relate what they've been working, slaving away in the lab to impact on a person. And that can be really motivating, because scientists don't have the corner office, they don't get typically stock options. If you're an academic scientist, it's really understanding what you're doing and the impact it can have on the community is important. So I think those are some key ways that our foundation is playing a role, in addition to ensuring we have the human capital that's necessary. So it's funding, but it's funding to young investigators who really can have that potential for making a significant impact in the progression of understanding Parkinson's disease and how to provide a cure for it.
Speaking now as a chair of neurology, it's so critical to attract young people into these rare disorders and to give them that early support. I was wondering, and maybe Annie, if any experience with that, any challenges or any good things of how do we keep attracting people to study these illnesses?
We do lots of activities with Solid. We have a lot of groups, MBA students at different universities, other academic groups coming to our offices, spending time with us, spending time with our patient community. For us, there isn't like us and them, right? I think just because of the genesis of our company, we have men with Duchenne that work at Solid. We have patient community in all the time. And I think for us, we're constantly trying to figure out how can we continue to inspire kind of this next generation of scientists, like to be interested in muscle biology, to be interested in trying to really, go after these incredibly challenging diseases. So I think for us as a company, however we can do that, whether it's funding postdocs, which we do, making sure that we're constantly inspiring everybody around us with what is life truly like to live with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We also make sure that our partners, so whether it's a manufacturer, in Texas or in anywhere, like that we're making sure to, reach out to them. COVID's been challenging, of course, and it's all been remote, but physically going to them, presenting to them so that they don't feel like they're kind of just not part of what is actually happening, that they feel inspired, that they feel that they understand the mission behind what we're trying to do is so critical.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think that the not us versus them is such an important piece of this. And when we began at the ML4 Foundation several years ago holding researcher and investigator conferences, we always did it attached to our family meetings precisely so that even bench scientists who for years had been working on animal models or cell cultures could be meeting children, and those were some of the most affected investigators by those encounters who would come to me and say, for 15 years I've been working on a zebrafish and I'd never met a child with this disease, and my work has been so propelled by that interaction. And so I really think that those kinds of experiences can be really motivating and really also change not just the emotional experience, but have really profound impact on the kinds of models that get developed, when they begin to spend time with families and really begin to understand some nuances of phenotype and some of the real experience of what this is like. It can really impact those preclinical models in ways that are truly beneficial to what they understand about the disease. So it on many levels, it can have profound impact.
That is the reason people go into science, is to help people, and then to actually see that is very motivating. Staci, we were talking outside a little bit about how with all this innovation in gene therapy and cell-based therapy, there's a lot of opportunities, but sometimes we don't have the tools yet to measure success in the population. So I was just wondering if you might expand on that a little bit.
It's extraordinarily challenging, I think, to determine what some of these endpoints may be for gene and cell therapies when we're dealing with either ultra-rare diseases where there's variability among patients, and so developing specific endpoints and showing effect can be really challenging. We were talking just before this about later onset and more slowly progressive diseases and how that's an added level of challenge in that it takes a lot of time to see an effect. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for patient advocacy groups to help in this work, and Rebecca mentioned this earlier, in working in natural history studies to better define phenotypes among patients and different patient groups, but also important to work on identifying and validating biomarkers that may be signs that we can see sooner than clinical impact, that there is an impact of a therapy. I think where the patient and caregiver voice is so important is also in determining what these endpoints may be and what is really a meaningful outcome. So I think we talk about big things like increasing lifespan, or really stabilizing disease overall, or preventing disease if we can treat children early. But if you talk with the patient community now, especially in later onset diseases, outcomes such as reducing falls or increasing speech clarity can be really meaningful for them. In younger children, reducing seizure frequency or improving swallowing so that feeding isn't such a challenge can also really impact families' day-to-day quality of life. And these are hard to measure in studies and hard to build into clinical trial protocols, but really have lasting impact on individuals and on families.
Thank you. Monica, I didn't know if you wanted to add to that, especially around the outcome measures in an illness that spans a longer lifespan. And
Sure.
what foundations can do.
So, I think for something like gene therapy that's going to be expensive manufacturing, to ensure that payers are going to pay for these expensive therapeutics, we're going to have to show substantial improvements. And so unlike a pill that, maybe will improve a symptom by 5 or 10%, I expect that we're going to have to show some significant improvement in order to get gene therapies paid for. I'm reminded of the before and after videos from kids with spinal muscular atrophy for Zolgensma. Like there's just no denying the incredible benefit that those kids had. I'm hoping that we may have something similar for Rett and other neurodevelopmental disorders. It'll remain to be, remains to be seen. We've put a lot of time and effort into trying to understand the symptoms that parents want to see improved in their kids. And, for us, it's communication. If our children could communicate, doesn't necessarily mean speak, but if they could communicate and we would know what's hurting, what's bothering them, what they need, that would be such a huge, huge advance.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience about what do the speakers recommend as the first step for a patient family member with a new mutation of a single gene? Where do people even start to get a voice? I don't know, Annie, if you want to start with that one.
I think what I always say to families, sometimes families get a diagnosis and they contact us or other companies wanting to get onto a clinical trial. And I think my first reaction to that family is always, we have to slow down a little bit, because what's most important is your son's care and making sure that you are able to be seen by a team that are able to really, truly, from an interdisciplinary manner, be able to look after your son and make sure that we really figure out his care before you even go down the odyssey of considering clinical trials. I guess in a way, and certainly in Duchenne, maybe we're kind of the lucky ones, right? Where we actually do have clinical trials for our disease. Certainly when our son was diagnosed, we were told to go home and love our son. And it's a different world than it was, 10 years ago when we received our diagnosis. So in many aspects, I think for families just trying to find their people, whether it be through making sure that they have the care in place. If there are advocacy groups that are vibrant and easy to find, I think that's another great source of trying to find your people that understand what you are going through and can help you navigate this new journey and being part of a team that you never wanted to be part of. So that would be my advice.
And those were the first words that came to mind, and Annie took them out of my brain, to find your people. And not just to find your care team, which is important, to find the people who know what questions you need to ask. Because I think for a family who receives a diagnosis that they weren't expecting, often it's a condition they've never even heard of. The diagnosis is often a devastating diagnosis with a poor prognosis, that you may not even know the questions to be asking. And so to find your people, to help you figure out what those questions are, to figure out how to care for your child, but also how to care for your family. And then to consider all of your options and figure out your next steps.
I think that what's interesting here is that when we talk about childhood diseases, and although some can be later onset, the first thing people think about is genetic screening. But with an adult onset disease like Parkinson's, very rarely do people talk about genetics, which is kind of ironic. We were at a gene and cell therapy conference, but about 10% of people with Parkinson's have a monogenic form of the disease, and it's really important for our community of about 1 million people to go and get tested. As the companies here in the Boston area are working on what will be, I think, a sea change of therapies for gene-targeted therapies, whether they be viral delivered therapies or small molecules or biologics. Just having our population aware that this is a possibility is something that's really important. And that's one of the reasons why our foundation is sponsoring a large study called PD Generation to offer this genetic testing and counseling to basically anybody with Parkinson's disease, so that we can prepare the field for what we hope the audience members will bring, which is new therapies for people living with Parkinson's.
And maybe, Monica, if you wanted to add a little bit to this too. It's so clear from this panel the power of sharing information across foundations and groups involved in this area. And I was just wondering your thoughts on that, and if there are already platform approaches for foundations to share this type of information with patients and other groups.
Yeah. I'm contacted probably once a week or a couple of times a month by parents whose children were diagnosed with a rare genetic disease where there isn't much known about the gene, or there isn't a community. If there is a community, great. If there's an advocacy group, then they know where to go. But oftentimes there isn't one, and they're really starting completely from scratch. And it's a rare disease, and which also makes it very difficult for fundraising to even get the resources necessary to start some basic research. So it can be quite overwhelming, but there are people that these families can connect with, like our organization and others, that can kind of give them a roadmap of some basic things to at least, begin with, like a patient registry. There are some kind of cheap ways to get one going. Biorepository, get some patient cells, mouse models, some basic things. So they're not starting totally from scratch, although it is quite an overwhelming endeavor.
Thank you. Well, with that, we're out of time. I wanted to thank our panel members for sharing their experience and their knowledge with us, and Monica for joining us remotely. Thank you very much.